Hey everyone, welcome to today's edition of One Single Story, where each weekday we tackle a single relevant question based on our Bible reading for that day. This week our reading is centered around the book of Colossians, and today I'm joined by Jay Rivenbark and Alyssa Bream, and we're going to look at a question from chapter 2, the last 4 verses of chapter 2 actually. It says, "You have died with Christ, and he has set you free from the spiritual powers of this world. So why do you keep on following the rules of this world, such as don't handle, don't taste, don't touch? Such rules are more human teachings about things that deteriorate as we use them. These rules may seem wise because they require devotion, pious self-denial, and severe bodily discipline, but they provide no help in conquering a person's evil desires." Sometimes we can read things and we take them completely out of context. And I will hear people often use similar verses to excuse all kinds of behavior. And I don't think that let me say this, I don't think when Paul writes these things, he's discounting or saying that you can't or shouldn't do some of these things. I think what he's saying is these things don't make you right with God. There may be some benefit to doing some of them, but they're not what saves you. So he says, why keep following the rules of this world? So what are some of the rules he's talking about, do you think? Because he talks about don't handle, don't taste, don't touch. And what are some useless rules, maybe? These first, this whole chapter is very similar, so the first 3 days are going to sound a lot alike. What are some useless rules today?
I think we've said it before, but the don't taste, I think it's about food. It's about those Jewish rules and how should Christians handle that. And I mean, when you look at the Old Testament, I think it kind of became like, if you follow all these rules, that means you're a holy person. But then we realize that you can follow all these outside rules and it doesn't really affect the heart. So you can put all of these rules and precautions into place, but if your heart is evil, you will find ways around them and you won't care and you will do whatever you want, no matter what outside seemingly good rule you follow. So I might pass on the second part to Jay because I think all my ones are going to get me in trouble.
Well, I think it's perfectly fine to get in trouble. That's okay. I think that's part of what we should try to do.
Maybe I'll get other people in trouble.
Have a discussion. But so what I would let me take off of what you would say. So I grew up in a very strict environment, specifically where dress was concerned. And gosh, I don't know how to say this because I don't want it may come across sexist, and I don't mean it that way.
Because it probably is.
It might be, I don't know. But there were certain, if you followed the rules, you were fine. And but as I got older, I realized that modesty was it had to start with the heart. And the reason why I think it might come across sexist, the only way I can say it is how I would relate to it. So it's hard for me to think about a man being immodest and it having some impact on me, because that's not what I would be attracted to. So I can only think of it in terms of women. But I have seen growing up women who followed the rules with what they wore, but had an immodest heart. and how I received it was different. Does that make sense? And I've also seen people who, in the environment I grew up in, would be dressed immodestly, but what I received from them was a modest heart. The what I experienced from them was sincere modesty, and it may have been because they were comfortable in that, or that was all they had, or they just didn't think about it in those terms. And so I think that what rules do is give us loopholes, you know, instead of dealing with the heart. Because there are times where if you ask me a question, I would say, sure, it's no problem. There would be other times where I might say, according to the letter of the law, that's okay. But I don't think it's appropriate. I just don't think that would be the wise thing to do in an interaction. And dress is the place where I grew up where most, so I couldn't wear shorts growing up, Um, and I can't imagine somebody looking at my legs and going, "Oh my gosh, I want some of that." I can't imagine that, right?
I can't imagine that either. I'm just saying. Yeah.
But do what?
Never mind.
I can't. So that doesn't register with me. I think there are some other things that I could do well within the bounds of what the world I grew up in called modesty. I could dress, but I could act inappropriately, and have. That would create much more problem than me dressing immodestly. Does that make sense? And so I do agree. I do think modesty, for whatever reason, was the thing I thought quickly about. I do think a modest heart will show up on the outside in how we dress and carry ourselves and act toward people. But I think if you start on the outside, it can be dangerous, and people never correct the heart problem and deal with that.
I had similar experiences growing up where there was a lot of rules, a lot of expectations. Some of them had things to do with things that you would consume or shouldn't consume, dress, even places you went or didn't go or shouldn't go. They were labels and divisions, and if you followed certain protocol and practices, then that was like a mark of spirituality and accomplishment. If you didn't, you were often labeled. And the thing, even as a young boy, that always confused me was how the people who were following, quote, the rules could treat other people so harshly, because it was a reflection of heart rather than actions. And that was hard for me to reconcile and understand the difference, because my experience was the people who seemed to follow man-made rules and regulations seemed to be the most difficult people to be with or live around, because it was a heart issue.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you and I aren't far apart in age. You grew up in a not dissimilar world, but it had changed significantly by the time you were an adult. But I can think back to particularly women, based on how they dressed. They were either considered loose. I can hear, like, that was the word used among church people. If they didn't dress in a particular way, they were loose. Like, how do you know that? And if you dressed in another particular way, you were holy. You were a godly person. And some of the, I used to say it like this. I grew up with women whose hair reached their butt and whose tongue drug the floor. And they were holy with their hair, but they could wear you out in a minute, with the way they talked. And men, not any different, same kind of scenario, just a different practice. And it was a set of rules that we don't have those rules today. So what are maybe some useless rules today?
I wouldn't classify as a rule, but I think there's an expectation even of people like attending church, with a certain amount of frequency. Would we like folks to be at church every every time the door's open? Sure, because we see benefit and value in that. But even to put weight in or try to read a person's heart based on church attendance can be a misnomer on our part. And so there would be a lot of areas that we may not even realize that we make those judgments based on things that are perceived. They may not even be pronounced, but they're perceived to us that are certain markers of spirituality or being a good person or godly person.
I think I just heard from Jay that I can skip church on Sunday and still be good.
That is not what you heard me
You
say.
can, but you want to get paid.
We do have online giving.
I think it's much easier to look at past generations and to see where those follies are, because as time moves on and you see this rule didn't help anything. Like when it comes to modesty, you would think, or I wouldn't say, I'll phrase that differently. People think sometimes that if a woman dressed modestly, then they're not going to get attacked by a man. But if you look at in the Middle East, it's not any different, where they're covering everything and the men still do horrible things to women. So I think it's a heart issue, and it's much easier to see that on the back end of things where you've come past that and you're looking in the rear view mirror. I think anyone I would bring up right now would probably prolong this podcast indefinitely. So
Well, we got like 4 minutes. So.
Got
good.
4 minutes.
I'm good.
Well, he denotes very clearly in here. He said, "Why do you keep on following the rules of the world?" I think it is a notable point that there are certain disciplines based on Scripture that we should follow and conduct our lives by. But if they are outside of that context and they fall under the rules of the world, we're not getting any closer to God based on keeping those things or being pious or self-discipline in areas that don't make any difference.
Yeah, well, so the last verse there, he says, they provide no help in conquering person's evil desires. What I think he's saying, or what I read when I read that, is stop abstaining doesn't solve the heart problem.
Yeah.
The heart problem helps you abstain. I don't think he's saying you might not need to observe some of these things.
Yeah,
completely.
not to have standards.
But it needs to inside out instead of outside in,
Right. Like, here's one maybe more modern example that maybe will resonate with different people. And I think this will be much more evenly divided among people who still think this is a bad thing and think that it's okay, is like reading Harry Potter. I think that there was, like, that's what I grew up with, where that was a line that if you read Harry Potter, like, you might become a witch.
Yeah,
you
so
know?
I think I've probably said this sometime before on this podcast. I can remember Cameron coming home from elementary school having traded somebody for some Pokemon cards, and he had Pokemon cards. And I can replay this in my head right now, and he could tell you all about it. But it is one of those when you look back on it, you go, God, that was a horrible parenting moment. When he pulled them out and showed them to me, I snatched them out of his hand. We're riding down the road. I threw them out the window.
So you littered.
Yes. Yeah, I littered and I broke my son's heart.
That's why he does his penance, picking up trash.
And he's yeah, exactly. And I look back on it and I think, gosh, what a right or wrong. I didn't.
I don't think you understood what Pokemon was.
I didn't. When I was in a culture that this was bad. It was magic. It was evil. It was wrong.
But even if it had been a right or wrong issue that had crossed the line, the response to it
was terrible.
And the teachable moment was
I lost it. I lost all ability to have any influence.
Right. That's what I'm.
Yeah.
And I think we see that a lot in the church too. Even when people are outside the confines of what self-discipline should be, or godly standards, or morality, that sometimes our approach to them, we miss a teachable moment or opportunity to build and foster a relationship, and for the genuine desire to help that person grow, develop, and change. Rather than
you need to buy some Pokemon cards for Cameron's stocking this year, okay?
Well, my grandkids have enough to go around. but that would have been a thing, and there were lots of others. Going to movies, what movies you watched, all of those things. Well, thank you for joining us today on this edition of One Single Story. We hope you'll be back with us tomorrow as we continue a conversation around the book of Colossians.